Have you ever watched someone at a stadium who simply wasn't there? 80,000 people screaming, hugging strangers, hating the referee, and this one person just sits, calm, like they exist in a completely different dimension. They're not pretending to be indifferent, they genuinely feel nothing. And if you've ever been that person at a match or in an office while everyone replays last night's game, you know exactly what that feels like. Everyone around you's on fire, and you're just standing there, waiting for it to end. Psychology has 6 reasons why this happens, and not one of them means something is wrong with you. The first reason, and the most fundamental, is what psychologists call reward sensitivity. This isn't personality, it isn't upbringing, it's literally how your brain responds to specific stimuli. In people who become sports fans, 3 things combine to trigger a powerful dopamine release: the unpredictability of the outcome, the competition between 2 sides, and the feeling of belonging to something larger than yourself. The brain receives this combination and switches on completely. Heart rate climbs. Time disappears. Defeat hurts. Victory feels like euphoria, but for other people, that same combination simply doesn't activate the mechanism at all. Not because they're cold or emotionally closed off, but because their nervous system is tuned to different frequencies. Schopenhauer, the philosopher Nietzsche worshipped before he broke with him entirely, wrote that the will towards something cannot be chosen consciously. It either exists or it doesn't. You cannot command yourself to want what you don't want. You can force yourself to show up to the stadium, but you cannot force your brain to explode at a goal. Different brains, different signals. That's the first and most straightforward reason. The second reason goes deeper, and it touches on how we construct a sense of self in the first place. Social psychology has long established that people carry a fundamental need for group belonging. Not simply being near others, but knowing which side you're on, who we are and who they are. Sports clubs are a perfect machine for this. You pick a team and receive a ready-made identity. Your color, your people, your enemy, your rituals. It costs nothing. It's available to anyone, but not everyone builds identity through a group. Nietzsche saw this clearly. He wrote about what he called Herdentrieb, the herd instinct. As one specific mode of human existence, the crowd offers safety, ritual, and constant confirmation that you're right. But there are people whose sense of self forms differently. Through ideas, through solitary thinking, through an internal conversation rather than external belonging. For such a person, the question, which team do you support, lands almost like what's your totem? It simply doesn't connect to how they understand themselves. This isn't better or worse. It's a different way of being human. The third reason, and it's consistently underestimated, is the role of early experience. Psychology is clear on this. Most durable interests take shape in childhood, not because we consciously choose them, but because the brain during certain developmental windows is uniquely open to new associations. If something excites, captivates, and creates a sense of community during that period, it stays permanently. If your father watched football every Saturday and brought you along, that ritual gets encoded, not just as a memory, as an emotional signature. Later, a stadium activates not just interest in the game, it activates something much warmer underneath. But if sport was never part of your early environment, the brain simply never builds that connection. And when an adult says, "I've never understood what the fuss about football is," they're not behind. They're not missing something essential. They just grew up somewhere that particular code was never installed. The existentialists call this facticity, what you receive without choosing. Sartre wrote that we are thrown into the world without a manual. The environment of childhood is the first throw, and no one asked permission. The first 3 reasons are about what was given to you. The next 3 are about how you yourself are wired. The 4th reason is about cognitive style, specifically how your mind naturally processes the world. Research shows that some people are drawn by default toward abstract thinking, toward systems, toward questions that don't resolve cleanly. They're more interested in mechanisms than outcomes. They want to understand not who won, but why it matters to anyone that someone won at all. For this type of mind, sport often reads as the same scenario repeating indefinitely under different names. The ball moves. Someone celebrates. Someone suffers. Tomorrow, it begins again. This doesn't mean sport is simple. It isn't. There's strategy, psychology, physics embedded in it, but it's perceived as a closed loop with no exit into a larger question. Camus wrote about the absurd, about a human being who searches for meaning in a world that offers none in return, and watching billions of people invest genuine passion into an outcome that changes nothing beyond itself. The abstract mind experiences precisely this, the absurdity of the ritual itself. Again, no judgment, just a different angle on the same stadium. The fifth reason is concrete and specific. It's about how a person manages their emotional energy. Sport is an emotional roller coaster. Anticipation before the game, tension throughout, joy or devastation afterward. And all of it depends entirely on people you've never met and never will. You have zero control over the result. For some people, that's precisely the appeal. The unpredictability, the adrenaline, the sharpness of the moment. But for others, and this is well documented in the psychology of emotional regulation, that type of experience doesn't produce pleasure, it produces exhaustion. Investing emotional energy into something you cannot influence feels less like excitement and more like waste. The Stoics called this the dichotomy of control. There are things that depend on us and things that do not. Marcus Aurelius practiced this distinction daily, literally as a written exercise. The result of a match is completely beyond your control. So to pour your heart into it from a Stoic perspective borders on irrational. This isn't coldness, it's a different form of wisdom, conserving yourself for where you actually have influence. The sixth reason, and perhaps the most psychologically interesting, is about the relationship with social norms. Personality research consistently shows that people who are less oriented toward what's socially expected more often hold interests that diverge from the majority. Not as protest, not to appear original, simply because their decisions, including where they direct their attention, are less shaped by what everyone else is doing. Sport is one of the most globally unified rituals in human history. It exists in every culture, every social class, every generation. It's practically the default language of belonging, and if someone is naturally less inclined to speak the default language, they simply speak another. Without performance, without a manifesto, just differently. Nietzsche wrote about the sovereign individual, the person who can make promises to themselves and keep them, who constructs their own scale of values rather than inheriting one ready-made. Indifference to sport alone doesn't make someone sovereign, but it can be one expression of a person who is living by their own compass rather than the crowd's. And here is what matters after all of this. A person who doesn't care about sports is not passionless, not isolated, not cold. They have simply directed their energy somewhere else, into music, technology, books, business ideas, into whatever actually ignites their particular brain. The 6 reasons we examined are not excuses and not diagnoses. They are a map. Different neural thresholds, different ways of building identity, different childhood environments, a different type of thinking, a different emotional economy, a weaker pull toward the default. Any one of them, or all 6 together, can explain why a stadium, for you, is just a building. Write in the comments, what is your version of sport? Where are you completely inside something, effortlessly, without explanation? without needing to convince yourself it's worth your time. Because if that place doesn't exist yet, that's a more important question than why you don't care about football.